All right, let's get started. So the first thing that we want to kind of talk about with our introduction to V-Ray here is going to be the main ways we're going to be interacting with V-Ray. Kind of treating this as our very first time getting into V-Ray. And the main thing we want to do is, of course, turn it on. We're going to do that through our plugin manager. And just kind of scroll down to the bottom here, and you'll see we've got our V-Ray from Maya turned on. There's a couple key places we're going to be seeing new V-Ray settings. The most obvious one's going to be the render settings here. And the render settings, you can see, are definitely fairly unique to V-Ray. We've got a few new tabs here. If you're used to Arnold, or if you're used to Mental Ray, RenderMan, some of these terms are going to seem really familiar. It's a lot of the same ideas from any modern renderer inside of V-Ray. And so a lot of the techniques you may have learned to use with other renderers are going to be perfectly applicable inside of V-Ray. So we got our render settings. We're going to be cruising through those quite a bit as we go through this lesson. Next, what we've got, if we go over and just let's just browse over to our node editor here, and we'll just do a create node. All my windows are on the other side. You can see inside of our create node menu, we do have a whole bunch of new V-Ray materials. And there's quite a bit of new stuff inside of V-Ray 3 as well that we're going to be going over as far as the materials are concerned. And we're just going to be kind of diving in and hitting all kinds of those things. The next place we're going to be seeing a lot of stuff as far as V-Ray is concerned is going to be under our create menu. You can see under our lights, we do now have our 4 V-Ray light types. And those 4 V-Ray lights are going to really get us all kinds of any kind of lighting that we need. And then under that, if we go right down to the bottom of that menu, you can see we've got this new V-Ray menu under create, and you can see we've got all sorts of stuff for all the different things that V-Ray can do. So you can see we've got V-Ray plane, metaball. One of the really big things that we're going to be talking about quite a bit is going to be the V-Ray object properties here. Displacements down here. V-Ray also has a nice little fur plugin built in. It's really limited, but for little fuzzies or like on a sweater or rug or something, it's pretty cool. And we're also going to be talking a lot about V-Ray proxies as well. V-Ray proxies are an incredibly powerful tool. We're going to be getting those in and out of our scene from this menu as well. The last place we're going to be interacting with V-Ray is a little bit more hidden, and that's going to be right here in our attribute editor. You can see that in the attribute editor up here in the menu, we've got the attribute rollout where we can add and edit attributes. And in this case, we can add custom V-Ray attributes to our objects. So you can see we've got stuff like subdivision for geo, rounded corners, object ID, fog, fade out kind of stuff. There's a bunch of really awesome new features as well. And if we go over, let's go over to that shader I had pulled up. You can see that different node types have different attributes added to them. So as you're kind of getting used to V-Ray and really kind of diving in, it'd be really beneficial for you to just go in and take a peek at that attribute menu and make sure you're not missing anything. So for example, my file texture here actually has some fairly important gamma information that we may want to use. So all of that will be extremely helpful for you. All right, so let's take a peek and just kind of go over our render settings here. So I went ahead and just reset my settings back to the default. Let me actually set my resolution back. There we go. I want to go through our V-Ray render settings and kind of go through and, discuss a little bit about the different settings that we want to change. One of the new things that happened in V-Ray 3 is the render settings actually got a really nice default set of values placed on them. So there's actually not a ton that we need to really talk about, but I'm still going to kind of go tab by tab here since it's an introduction DVD, and just kind of go through each render global here and just kind of touch base on it at the very least. When I'm inside of V-Ray, one of the first things I do is always set my image format to EXR. You can also set it to EXR multi-channel. That's your own personal preference. And actually, this was my resolution that I wanted to work at here for my render. There's also some specific image format options you can access by clicking that button right there. So you can see for my EXR, you can do like auto data window, which will put the nice little crop box around your objects in your EXR. You can also, if you need to do 32-bit, you can do that. Or if you just need, most of the time we're going to be doing 16-bit. You can also choose the compression type, which also has been set to scanline zip as the default, which is recommended for Nuke. Just kind of scrolling down here, something that's a little bit hidden and a little bit different about V-Ray. If you need to render an image sequence, you do need to turn on the animation checkbox. And if you turn on the animation checkbox, you also need to turn on this render animation only in batch mode. If you're dealing, most of the time, we want to go over to our rendering subset of menus here and go up to render, batch render if we want to launch this sequence. And without that checked, it's actually just going to render each frame right in your V-Ray frame buffer, which usually is not ideal since we want to be using our file name prefix. Just so that, that's definitely worth mentioning. Another thing really quick worth mentioning is going to be there are some new flags that are more unique to V-Ray. So rather than like render layer, it just says layer, for example. We're going to be discussing the V-Ray frame buffer. You can see the little shortcut to show it here. That's the render of the scene that we're going to be looking at today. Just a really simple scene to kind of walk us through some of these render settings. But a nice default now inside of V-Ray 3 is that we're going to be using this V-Ray frame buffer by default. So let's bounce over to the next tab here. Just kind of cruise down through. You can see there's a couple options. So some of the Maya users, as a Maya user, you may be used to hitting 3 on an object to smooth it. If you want to maintain that functionality, you can turn on render viewport subdivision. V-Ray does have its own subdivision built in that's actually pretty nice. So most of the time, I actually leave this off when I'm doing actual lighting work. But for convenience, it's definitely nice to just kind of turn on as you need it, all kinds of stuff inside of the advanced options as well. You can see you can turn off things like reflection, glossy effects. You could turn off your textures if you wanted to, turn off shadows. We're actually going to be touching on some of this stuff in a later chapter as well. The image sampler section right here actually gets a chapter dedicated completely to its functionality here. The adaptive, now it's just called adaptive mode. It used to be called the adaptive DMC. But this is essentially going to be how we're controlling the overall quality of our image with some additional controls right here in the DMC sampler section. But honestly, most of the time I deal personally with all of that stuff in this adaptive section up here, and I usually just leave this stuff alone. The environment rollout section is pretty nice. You can turn on this override environment, and you can see we've got a nice ray switch built in where we can map in an HDRI to GI texture, reflection texture, refraction texture, also background, which is cool. And you can just kind of flip through this stuff yourself. You can kind of get a nice idea of it. We've got like depth of field, motion blur. There's a built-in V-Ray sun and sky section. We're going to be talking about that a little bit later as well. And a lot of this stuff don't ever really need. If you do want a shelf, I don't actually really use it, but you can see if I click this little add button right here, or sorry, create, replace. I told you I don't really use it that much, but maybe handy for some of you guys. If you're a shelf user, I tend to be more of a menu person myself, but that's right there. The GI tab, where you're gonna turn on your GI, which is cool. And this actually is going to have a chapter completely dedicated to itself as well. Just really briefly in this introduction, I am going to be setting my secondary bounce to light cache, which is an approximated secondary bounce. And I'm going to set my irradiance map to just medium quality so that it's one less pass, so it renders a little bit faster. Over on the settings tab, you can see we're going to be taking a look at both this default displacement subdivision section and also our render region division. Really quickly, a nice new feature in V-Ray 3 is going to be the way that V-Ray automatically figures out a bucket size for you, and then as the render goes, it'll actually subdivide those buckets, and it will help prevent what Chaos Group kind of coined the term stuck bucket syndrome. So you can see right there, they get smaller and smaller to help figure out and finalize those last few remaining buckets, which is an awesome little feature. So the next little area here, definitely worth mentioning and setting some values for yourself, is this default displacement and subdivision section. Kind of a funny little default value. This is actually one of my least favorites and should probably get changed. I end up changing it every time, but you can see what's happening here is whenever V-Ray finds a flag to subdivide, and in V-Ray, that does mean if you hit 3, that's flagged for subdivision. It's not like Mental Ray where it just subdivides it twice when you press 3. By pressing 3, it throws this object over to these settings right here. And what's happening is V-Ray is actually trying to, or will subdivide your object continuously until the edge length of a polygon is 4 pixels or less. And it's pixels on your actual render because I have this view dependent checkbox turned on. If I was to uncheck that, that would actually be for Maya units. But in general, what I like to do is set my edge length to something pretty low, so maybe like 0.1. And I set my max subdivs to be a value that I want it to actually max out at, so like 2 or 3. So I'm giving it an edge length that it will never be able to achieve, and I'm able to control exactly how many times it actually subdivides, which is very important for me in most situations. This is a really common mistake I see beginner or people just starting out with V-Ray make, where they forget to flag this and they go in and they subdivide everything, and it essentially creates like a displacement on every single object where some objects are getting subdivided 7, 8, 10 times because they're trying to achieve that edge length of 4 pixels. So it creates a lot of unnecessary memory usage and a huge ramp up in computer pre-calculation time. So a really nice cue to let you know if you've done that is when you hit this little render icon. This is kind of the pre-calculation right in the beginning. Mine already started because it's not really doing that much. But if it just sits there and hangs for like 30, 40 seconds or a couple minutes, that's almost always because you have too much subdivision going on. So just kind of flying over to our render elements here, the render elements tab. This is also essentially going to have a full chapter kind of dedicated to it. And it's really all of the passes and the different layers that make up our render. And we can just have them go into channels. So you can see over here on my V-Ray frame buffer, I've got this little drop down here, and I've got my GI, my reflection. I don't have a specular. I probably should have a specular, so I can go ahead and double click, or I can just click add. I can double click, whatever I want to do. And now if I render that one more time, you can see I've got a specular, and it's pretty cool. Definitely works really well. You can see it's interactive here. I can just kind of flip through and I can see all of the different pieces of my render, which is pretty great. And it's got a lot of other functionality as well for utility passes. In general, when I'm working, I have a beauty set of render elements and then a utility set of render elements. We're going to be discussing a little bit about that as well in this video series. You can see there's stuff like Z-depth, velocity, and then there's a whole system for setting up RGB mats as well. Lastly, we have V-Ray RT Engine tab, and that's going to be a whole, all of the settings that you need to control your V-Ray RT, which is going to be your IPR button. And that's also going to have a whole another, we're going to be expanding on a lot of this stuff. So let's go ahead and do one quick render of our full scene, get that back again, and we'll talk about the V-Ray frame buffer. Cool. Here's our render, looking just as it did before. And in the next part of the video here, we need to talk about this V-Ray frame buffer. This V-Ray frame buffer is one of the best parts of V-Ray, in my opinion. It's a really amazing replacement to the relatively crappy Maya render view. This thing that's over here, that we don't even really need it anymore. And it's because the V-Ray render view does all the same stuff and way, way, way more. So right off the bat, one of the really nice features, you actually may have already seen, I don't believe it's on by default, but this track mouse while rendering makes it so that another right here is your render region button, since I just clicked it. As I click render, you can see that that's actually, those buckets are following wherever my mouse goes. And that seems almost a little gimmicky maybe right from the start. If you know, it's not. So that seems, maybe like it's just a cool feature and not super important, but it can actually really save you a little bit of rendering time and waiting time. If you imagine you're rendering a character's face and you wanted the render to start on the eyeball, or I wanted this render to start right on this highlight, I can just simply press the render button and hold my mouse there, and it'll follow out from that center area, which is great. So another feature that we've got here that's a little bit different is, we already looked at this a little bit, but the ability to see all of our channels directly in our render view. There's also this luminance mode, monochromatic mode, where we can just see only the grayscale, which is also really helpful for establishing value and that sort of thing. And if you do need, you can send this image over to your Maya frame buffer if you wanted to kick out a JPEG or something. Actually, something worth mentioning, you can see that when I sent this image over by clicking that button right there, it's in linear space rather than sRGB. And there's a checkbox in our render settings. I can turn on convert image to sRGB for render view. And now when I send that image over, it'll be in the same correct color space that I'm used to. You can also see that it baked in that timestamp. If I don't want that timestamp on my image, when I send it over, I can just click this red box right here. One more thing to mention on that. This show stamp controls button might be off by default. I'm actually not sure. So you definitely want to go in and, if you want to see how long your render took, it'll be right there. And now if I send that guy back over, you get the idea. So V-Ray, something that makes it a little bit different from Maya, from the regular render view again, is that we have the ability to save out our EXR directly from our render view, rather than just saving out the formats that Maya supports, which I actually don't even think it supports EXR. But you can see if I click this save button, it'll just go in, I can select an output format right here, EXR. But if I hold down, you can see we have some other options here. So this little button will save all of the channels to separate files. And then this one right below it, it's kind of hard to see, but that's a red 1 over top of it. And that red 1 means one file, and it's going to save a multi-channel EXR. So you can see now it's actually automatically set to EXR, and it'll just save all of the channels bundled together. We can also load images, or I can clear it. So let's take a look down here. There's a whole list of icons. Some of the main buttons that we need to really know exactly what they're doing. The first one right here is on by default, and that's going to be your sRGB viewer correction for your linear workflow. We're going to have a little discussion about linear workflow inside of V-Ray and how it pertains to V-Ray 3 in a little bit, probably in chapter 3. I say that like I don't know because this is chapter 1 and I'm still recording them all. But you can see if I click that off, it goes down into linear space. If I click it on, we get our sRGB correction. You never want to work with this in linear space. It's not really correct in any way whatsoever. Right next to it, I already have it turned on, but this is the history tab. So this history, the render history, will let you load up images. So actually, let me we can just clear it here. So you can select all these. These are some test renders for a later chapter. And actually one of the new features, you can dock this now, which is cool. And the first time you open this, it's actually going to prompt you and say, where do you want to put this history? So you can see I've got mine in the temp file, and I'm only taking up 200 megabytes. You may want to take up a little bit more than that, maybe like 2 gigabytes instead of just 200 megabytes. And oops, sorry, bring that history back up. A nice feature that it will do is this autosave. And each time you do a render then, it's actually going to automatically save those channels to disk for you. And it doesn't just save a single image, it's actually going to go in and save all of the respective channels as well. So this is a multi-channel EXR that's living on disk, and you can load it up at a later time. It's also going to be really helpful if Maya crashed and you really wanted to see that render. Each time you hit that render button, it's just going to make a backup of the render that you did. It also gives you the ability, so maybe if I go in here and let's make this, go over to the attribute editor, let's make this base reflection color just kind of yellow on our map here. Make it kind of a gold, something like that. Let's hit that render button. And if I want to compare these and see my new fancy gold, or I guess cheap plastic gold, that's got the it's got the paint rubbing off there, showing the underneath material. Once that finishes up, that was a broken render when I paused it. You can see I can hit A on this one, and I can just wipe back and forth from my current render to the new. You can also, if you have a bunch of them listed here, you can swap. You can actually set the B channel. If you want to click this button right here, it'll swap A and B. And if you wanted to do like a vertical, a little bit, it just feels wrong. A little bit, a little bit more awkward. But that's up to you. You can kind of do whatever you want. So that's a really nice feature. Being able to just kind of load up and always have this kind of ongoing history attached to your V-Ray frame buffer at all times. Continuing on our list of cool stuff in the V-Ray frame buffer, I'm just going to click A, and I'm going to click A again. So I'm kind of assigning A and then hitting A button a second time to turn off the wipe mode. But right here, if I click this, you can see I can show corrections control. And I'll bring up this menu here. These are non-destructive color tweaks that you can do to your image. It's for sure worth bringing up that when you're messing with this stuff, so for example, if I turn on my white balance checkbox, if I want to warm this up or cool it down, or actually it's the opposite of that, but whatever I'm doing to this, if you did a batch render, the batch render is still going to be kicking out a linear EXR, and that linear EXR is not going to have any of this baked into it. It's just going to be a regular old linear EXR. So if you know that in comp they're maybe adding a little bit of a color curve, I'm holding control and clicking on this curve. Let's get a little. It's not the easiest to use, but if I wanted to do something like this, get a nice little S curve there, and then we'll give it a little bit of contrast. If I knew that they were doing something like that in comp, I can just get it built in my render right off the bat. Or what's way more common, you can see I have a LUT right here. Now, I've just got a kind of generic Alexa LUT loaded up, and you can see if I turn that checkbox on, and by the way, this is right here as well, I need to turn off my sRGB button so I can actually view the LUT properly. And in general, a LUT is a really nice way of just remapping the colors in your image. You can see my yellow got a little funkier. So there, if this is actually a film, if there's an Alexa LUT, so it's going to be doing something a little bit different to some of the reds. This has got a little bit of orange in it. So the really amazing thing about this is you can see it's properly rolling off this highlight to be more like a film camera. Not a film camera, but a video camera. And so if I flip back to just sRGB, you can see that curve is just kind of, this value is going pretty high, so it's clipping out. But when I turn on the LUT, it's actually I can look in here and I can see all of the detail of that reflection pass laying underneath, which is pretty awesome. So let's turn that back off. We'll just flip back over to sRGB for now. So a lot of these are corresponding. You can see there's white balance, HSL, color balance, histogram. There's our color curves. There's a little exposure setting. If you want to load up a background image, you can do that, which is pretty cool. We've got our LUT, and then there's some stereo camera options as well that if you're going to be doing that, you can play around with it. There's also this little post-process lens effects. Again, I don't actually remember ever using this, but it's there, and you can see if I crank up let's turn the size down a little bit, and you can just kind of play around with it. If you wanted to get a little bit of bloom, there's also this glare effect. So it's just if you know for some reason that you want this or that the compositors are doing this or something, you can have it on. I've never had it on, but it's there. The only time I see people use this is people who don't really use compositing. They're not doing this stuff in Nuke, so they want to utilize it inside of V-Ray and just send this. And, this image you can just send right to client with a little bit of this turned on. So let's actually turn off the bloom effect, turn off the glare effect, and then we can just close that little menu. So that's really the V-Ray frame buffer. And we're going to be talking, a lot of these same ideas. This is, just our intro chapter here, just kind of going over the really basics. Just so that we're all kind of on the same page as I'm kind of moving through some of these other parts like materials and, going over the adaptive DMC and getting into render layers and object properties and just kind of expanding on the whole rest of the features that V-Ray has to offer. So we will continue on and we'll probably talk about the adaptive DMC. And we'll do a little bit of linear workflow and materials in the coming chapters. So stay tuned.